That's usually the hardest part of any meeting, right? Um, After my introduction, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters. I'll introduce Heather. We'll have our presentation. You can put questions in the chat, and we will take questions after the presentation. All in, we expect to be approximately 1 hour. So I wanted to tell you about the League, and I think the best way to do that is to show you this.
Democracy doesn't run on autopilot. It works because people show up. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting the freedom to vote and empowering every voter with the information they need to participate confidently in our democracy. Right here in Palm Beach County, we educate voters, register new voters, protect voting rights, and help ensure elections are fair, accessible, and accurate. From voter registration drives and community forums to election protection, civic education, and grassroots outreach, our volunteers are on the ground every election cycle, strengthening democracy where it matters most. Because informed voters make stronger communities and a healthy democracy depends on participation from all of us. Join us, get informed, get involved.
We appreciate the efforts and the funding by Florida Philharmonic Network and the assistance of a variety of people who created this video. We hope that you found it informative and inspiring.
If I can ask for all of you to please take your seats.
Oh, just a minute. That's somebody else. That's the next part. Okay. So my co-presenter is Heather Vasquez. Heather joined the League of Women Voters Palm Beach County earlier this year because she wanted to make a difference. And there's a role for everyone, and the League needs everyone. The League wants everyone to be involved. We all have something that we can do. Heather began her professional journey with the state of Florida and eventually transitioned to the federal government. She is currently serves as a guardian ad litem and is helping to rebuild the Palm Beach chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I am delighted to introduce Heather, who will start our presentation content. Heather, I've made you a co-host. I think we're all set to go.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. So here's the agenda for today's presentation. And in order to understand what is happening with redistricting today in Florida, we must step back and look at some very important background information. So we'll quickly look at redistricting requirements and the move towards mid-decade redistricting, Florida's fight for fair districts, and current redistricting efforts, the League of Women Voters of Florida's position, and finally, we'll offer some suggestions and tools for voters who oppose mid-decade redistricting in Florida and want to take action. So first, we'll briefly overview redistricting and the current national landscape of mid-decade redistricting. So why are we talking about redistricting in Florida in 2025 and 2026 when Florida already redistricted after the 2020 census in 2022 as required by law? So there's a process for drawing the district lines, and redistricting is actually the last part of a three-step process. And the process is the same for federal and state districts. So every 10 years, the US Census Bureau counts the United States population, and then the updated counts are used to determine which state populations have increased or decreased. And then the new population counts are used to determine the number of representatives that each state in the country receives. And this process is known as apportionment. And by federal law, the size of the House of Representatives is set at 435 seats, but the number of elected representatives and their district areas change over time. As an example, based on the data released in the 2020 census, Florida and 5 other states saw an increased population, so they each gained a district and therefore an additional representative. Texas gained 2 districts and 2 representatives, and some other states lost representatives in the process. And finally, the third step is redistricting, which is creating the maps that determine the boundaries of electoral districts. And again, this is done on the national as well as the state level. And it's important to remember that the last census was done in 2020, so there is no new census data since then. Sorry, one moment. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So states are responsible for determining the maps for their state, and states have differing ways to set their boundaries for these maps. Some have independent commissions, and some states like Florida use legislatures to draw their lines, and others use a combination. So there are 3 different maps that end up getting created, one for the US House of Representatives, one for the state Senate, and one for the state House of Representatives. So redistricting basically just moves neighborhoods around and determines which neighborhoods are included in each map's boundary. Therefore, redistricting impacts how our communities are represented in the US and local government and how resources are distributed among our communities. And ideally, each state should create fair district maps, but that hasn't always been the case. Which leads us to gerrymandering. We've all probably heard of this term. And gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral boundaries to disadvantage a group of voters based on their political views or race. And the term dates to 1812 when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed into law a redistricting plan that included a district many thought looked like a salamander. So it was nicknamed gerrymander. And political parties use partisan gerrymandering to craft maps that lock in an outside share of seats for their party. So there is no federal law against gerrymandering, but there are some federal protections in place. And no matter when the redistricting happens, it must comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act bars voting maps that would result in diluting the voting power of minorities. And the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits race from predominating during the redistricting process. So this becomes a balancing act, which is currently being challenged in the Supreme Court. In October, SCOTUS heard arguments on a Louisiana case that challenges these protections. So this case, Louisiana versus Calais, questions whether it is legal to draw districts based on race under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it questions whether a new map drawn in Louisiana with a second Black majority congressional district is an unconstitutional racial gerrymander under the 14th Amendment. So the SCOTUS ruling is expected no later than early July, and some, including Governor DeSantis, have made statements that they expect the SCOTUS ruling to overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So again, why are we discussing redistricting in the middle of a decade when the census was done in 2020 and the maps should be good for 10 years? So mid-decade redistricting began in Texas in July 2025 when the president called openly for 5 more U.S. House seats, with the stated objective to gain more Republican House seats in the 2026 midterm election. Then the redistricting movement spread to other states. And Florida entered the discussion in July 2025 when Governor DeSantis first stated his reasons to pursue redistricting, which we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So basically, the states are revisiting their congressional maps outside the normal cycle to gain a partisan advantage ahead of the 2026 elections. And this is all before a single voter has their voice heard. So is mid-decade redistricting legal? At least 11 states, not Florida, explicitly prohibit state legislative mid-decade redistricting, congressional mid-decade redistricting, or both in their constitutional language. The Florida Constitution states the legislature at its regular session in the second year following each decennial census by joint resolution shall apportion the states. And the U.S. Constitution requires that states use decennial census data to redistrict. And this also applies to mid-decade map drawing. They should be relying on those same census data reports. So while it is unusual, it does happen occasionally. So since 1970, only 2 states, Texas in 2003 and again in 2025, and Georgia in 2005, had voluntarily redrawn their congressional maps between censuses for partisan advantage. However, districts have been drawn or redrawn by court orders in the middle of a decade. So we'll talk more about the League of Women Voters position later in this presentation, but we would like for you to know right now is how the League of Women Voters believe redistricting should occur. The responsibility for drawing maps should be given to an independent commission to avoid partisan gerrymandering. And maps should be drawn to ensure effective representation for racial and linguistic minority groups. And the process should protect and preserve communities of interest, and the entire redistricting process should be open and include citizen participation at all levels. And map drawing must explicitly reject considering factors that provide an unfair advantage, such as partisan affiliation, incumbent protection, or a candidate's residence. And this lovely lady you see here on this slide is the League of Women Voters of the United States CEO, Selena Stewart, who has denounced the current moves to redistrict in several states across the U.S. And she stated that there should be no tit for tat, that it erodes public trust in democracy, and it's a disservice to the people. And voters deserve fair representation. And the League of Women Voters will fight for voters' voices. So now we'll get into the story of that fight, of Florida's history of gerrymandering, our battle for fair districts, and the passage of the Fair Districts Amendments to the Constitution in 2010. So over a period of many years, Florida was one of the most gerrymandered states in the country under both Democratic and Republican leadership. And in 2008, the League and a coalition of partners composed 2 citizen initiative ballot amendments, 5 and 6. Those amendments, also called the Fair Districts Amendments, established criteria that congressional and state legislative districts must meet when drawing boundaries for state offices or congressional districts. So the League of Women Voters of Florida collected petitions to help get Amendments 5 and 6 on the ballot, and the League encouraged voters to vote yes. And then in 2010, the citizens in Florida voted overwhelmingly to enact the Fair District Amendments to the state's constitution to stop partisan gerrymandering. That's 63% of voters approved both amendments. So the amendments 5 and 6, the only difference between the two is that Amendment 5 addresses the state legislative districts, and Amendment 6 addresses the federal U.S. House of Representatives districts. So the primary fair districts provisions require that district lines not be drawn to favor one political party over another, and they should not be drawn to harm the voting power of racial or language minorities, and are contiguous. And these requirements apply to all the maps drawn, all three maps for the House of Representatives, the Florida Senate, as well as the Florida House. But even though this was passed, the Florida legislature didn't follow the new Fair Districts amendments and ignored the will of the people. In 2012, um, gerrymandering did not end, and it continued. Despite Florida legislators' promise to adhere to the Fair Districts criteria in early 2012, when it was time to draw lines for the federal, state Senate, and state House districts, they violated the Fair District amendments. So this map you see here shows Congressional District 5, which is in red. And it's a very weird shape that only gerrymandering can describe. And maps like that are designed to keep the voters from having a fair voice. And it took years of litigation and extended involvement from the League of Women Voters of Florida and other groups to finally bring about more fair maps. And then finally in 2015, the court approved new congressional and state Senate maps. So now you see District 5 is in the purple across the top. And so it was the League of Women Voters of Florida and other groups that submitted the maps that were finally chosen by the court. And this map remained in place until redistricting was done again in 2022, according to the Constitution. So after the 2020 census, it was time to begin redistricting. And then Governor DeSantis objected the Fair District standards and submitted his own map. And that new map eliminated North Florida's District 5, which is a majority Black district and previously represented by a Democrat. And opponents decried it as racially discriminatory. However, the Florida's legislature went along with the governor's map, even though it stripped Black voters of fair representation. So the League of Women Voters of Florida and other groups challenged the new map since it clearly violated the Florida Constitution's Fair District amendments. And litigation continued for the next 3 years. And then in July 2025, Florida Supreme Court rejected the challenge by the League of Women Voters of Florida and other groups, and they upheld the congressional map that was created by DeSantis. And they ruled that restoring this district, which united Black communities across North Florida, would be an impermissible racial gerrymander under the U.S. Constitution and would violate the Equal Protection Amendment. So remember that this also ties back into the current case that SCOTUS is hearing with the Louisiana versus Calais. It's a very similar argument that they're making with that one. So these two maps show North Florida's congressional maps before and after the 2022 redistricting. So the map on the left was the final map of 2015, which was approved by the courts after that long litigation that started in 2012. And again, District 5 is the purple district. And then the map on the right was created by Governor DeSantis and approved by the legislature in 2022. So it shows how geographically this majority Black congressional District 5 was basically dismantled. So instead of going from east to west, this map now divides North Florida from north to south. And District 5 is also a smaller geographic area, but you can see it's still in purple, although, yeah, it's much, much smaller. So the problem with the new map is that the Black voters from District 5 were scattered into several predominantly Republican-held districts. And that dilution of the Black vote was demonstrated in the next elections, since the area is no longer represented by Black Congresspeople. And now those new districts formed in 2022 are represented by white Republican congressmen. And this is the map that it currently remains in effect. And you can see the entire map here. So with this map, Florida currently has 28 seats in the House of Representatives, 20 are Republican and 8 are Democrat. And while the League of Women's Voters of Florida did not support this map because it diluted the power of the minority voices, this is the current map that we're dealing with. So on July 17th, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court finally settled the lengthy litigation over the 2022 maps. And then based on the census, Florida gained a seat going from 27 to 28 House seats. And following the 2022 redistricting map that was in place, Republicans gained 4 more seats in Congress. And the previously majority Black District 5 was divided into other districts, diluting the power of the minority vote. So why would the governor want to start the map drawing process again? So on July 24th, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis first proposed mid-decade congressional redistricting in Florida. And at this time, he stated that Florida should be given an additional seat in Congress and called for new census data. He also suggested that the population shifts within Florida would necessitate redistricting. And then on August 11, 2025, Governor DeSantis stated that he and Attorney General James Uthmeier wrote a letter to the U.S. Department of Commerce to request an additional seat in Congress and that they supported an update to the 2020 census. And that would actually mean another state would have to lose a seat in Congress. And he again cited the recent Florida Supreme Court decision upholding his North Florida congressional maps as another reason for redistricting. And he also cited the anticipated SCOTUS decision on the Louisiana versus Calais case on whether race should be considered in determining districts. And he repeated similar comments several times during the summer and fall. So on September 8th, 2025, Florida House Speaker Daniel Perez announced the creation of a select committee on congressional redistricting to look at drawing a new congressional map. And there were no further announcements or actions made for many weeks. And then finally, in late November, the first 2 meetings of the select committee were announced, which were December 4th and 10th, where they reviewed the redistricting general information and also reviewed the court cases around redistricting. And no public testimony was permitted at either meeting, despite large numbers of people in and outside the meeting room who had traveled to Tallahassee to speak out against the redistricting. And those citizens included a large group of leaders and members of the League of Women Voters of Florida, along with other groups and also individual concerned citizens. And on December 10th, Speaker Perez also stated that he had no direct or indirect conversation with the White House, nor any outside pressure. And when pressed, the House hired lawyer confirmed the legislature would rely on census data from 2020 if it moves forward with redistricting. And then on December 8th, the Senate president told reporters that it made sense for Florida to hold off while awaiting the SCOTUS ruling in Louisiana versus Calais. So last summer, President Trump asked the country to consider mid-decade redistricting. And soon thereafter, it appeared that Governor DeSantis heeded the president's request when he declared Florida's intention to redistrict. And given the context in which the POTUS requested states to pursue mid-decade redistricting for partisan political gain, speculation and concern grew about partisan intent driving the rush to mid-decade redistricting. And on December 3rd, in response to questions and criticism about the appearance of partisan motives for redistricting in this political climate, Governor DeSantis acknowledged that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional and stated that redistricting in Florida would not be done for partisan gain. And instead, regarding redistricting, Governor DeSantis stated that Florida will be forced to do it because the Supreme Court's Voting Rights Act decision is going to impact the current map. So he's basically saying that this upcoming court case is going to cause Florida to have to revisit their map. However, election attorney Andy Bartos, speaking to the House Select Committee on Redistricting, had a different point of view. And he stated that the following regarding the upcoming SCOTUS decision on whether race should be considered in drawing districts. He said, in terms of binding effect, it has a binding effect on Louisiana, and whether Florida chooses to keep its map in place or await the next cycle or await on litigation, that will be a judgment called made when we see that decision. So as of today, the SCOTUS decision has not been announced in that case. Again, we expect that sometime in July. So on January 7th, the governor officially announced that he was calling a special session on congressional redistricting. And it was originally scheduled for April 20th to 24th. However, he announced on April 15th that the session would be delayed a week and that it will now take place from April 28th through May 1st. And he also added 2 additional topics to the special session regarding AI and child safety, as well as medical freedom. And again, he has repeatedly expressed his expectation of the outcome of the SCOTUS decision on Louisiana versus Calais. And while at the same time, he has been acknowledging that maps for partisan gain would be unconstitutional. But as of today, the governor hasn't released a proposed map. And it's important to remember that we still do not have any new census data since that 2020 census. So what do Floridians say about redistricting? Do Floridians support redistricting or not? So if you're concerned about the mid-cycle redistricting, you're not alone. And Common Cause commissioned Noble Predictive Insights to conduct multiple polls on redistricting. And findings show broad opposition to mid-decade redistricting from Democrats, Republicans, and voters with no party affiliation in Florida. And even including voters who supported Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election. So 55% of Floridians reject mid-decade redistricting. And an overwhelming majority of voters in Florida support independent commissions made up of citizens to draw district lines instead of state lawmakers. And 66% of Floridians support Congress banning maps that favor one political party. And 66% support Congress banning mid-decade redistricting. And there's been even a new survey by Emerson College published this month that finds 56% of Florida likely voters think a mid-decade redraw of Florida congressional districts is a bad idea. So now I will turn the presentation back to Janet.
So Heather, I think you need to stop sharing.
Okay.
Here we go. Heather, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see my slide, please? Great. Okay. So Heather has very well explained the redistricting and why this topic is now up again for a special session. But League Florida certainly has a position. And this is President of League Florida, Jessica Lowe Minor, who quotes in August of 2025 that Floridians really want our leaders to be elected by us, to represent us, and to focus on kitchen table issues such as rising healthcare costs, homeowners insurance, housing affordability, education, and the fact that so much money is spent on groceries and childcare, and that this appears, especially without new census data, to be partisan issues, especially since we know that our 28 House of Representatives number will not change. So there's no legal justification to redistrict. We don't have census data. We're not going to increase our seats. There's no court order requiring this. And 63% of the voters in Florida in 2010 chose fair district amendments. And as many of us know, in Florida, the minimum threshold for a constitutional amendment to Florida's constitution is 60%. So the legislatures can't point to a specific legal reason for this special session. And partisan gerrymandering is illegal in Florida. So how can Florida be engaged in this? Well, Jessica Lowe Minor reiterated in December 2025 that this highly partisan national context, it really helps create the deep suspicion, the lack of transparency, and why we're moving forward. Florida wants the citizens of Florida want voters to choose politicians and not politicians to choose their voters. So I'm really honored to have both Rich Bartholomew, who chairs our advocacy committee, and Sandy Kaltman, who co-chairs Voter Coalition Rights, on with me today. They have really taught all of us a lot about advocacy. And what can citizens do about this topic of mid-decade redistricting? You may remember earlier this year, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, was very active, especially in Minnesota. There were protests around the country that made their operations harder to sustain, and sustained resistance created economic and political pressure. We have our voice. Our voice is our power. NoPartisanMaps.org is one of the organizations leading the effort to help all of us find our voice. This website provides a lot of information, as does a toolkit available on the League of Women Voter Florida website. There are specific links to take you for more information, and very importantly, interested citizens are invited to join all of our partners in Florida across the state for a mobilization day of action at the Florida State Capitol next Tuesday, April 28th. This rally was originally scheduled for today and was postponed because Governor DeSantis postponed the special session. There'll be mock hearings, there'll be a lot of information, a lot of camaraderie, and we will collectively be using our voice. So some talking points for when you email or call your representatives include that this is not a cheap endeavor. The special session itself costs funds, and taxpayer pay for litigation. And I cannot imagine the amount of money spent on the litigation in the past about our maps. And here in the middle of the decade, we're going to be doing it all over again. And that taxpayers, at the end of the day, they want the money used for their kitchen table issues: groceries, affordability, homeowners insurance, not litigation and legal fees. And fun fact, the cost of the special session exceeds $50,000 a day. We want our legislators to focus on our needs, what keeps us up at night: affordability, healthcare, homeowners insurance. So sometimes people say, well, other states are doing it. And despite what other states may do, like California and Texas, maybe Louisiana, Florida's Constitution has an explicit prohibition on partisan map making, and legislators have sworn an oath to support and defend both the US and Florida constitutions. All of this, all of these activities cause confusion. Look at how many of us are on today's call, and it takes power away from the people. Redistricting should serve the voters, not the politicians. Your voice, your vote, your power. So we encourage you to stay aware. There'll be a lot of media covering Florida next week. League Florida will also be having statements. And of course, the mobilization day of activity on April 28th. Here are some additional dates to watch. The redistricting may affect which candidates are able to run for which offices. So, for example, Republican Brian Mast and Democrat Jared Moskowitz, their positions may be changed because of any map redistricting. And let's remember, we still don't have a proposed map. So in summary, we know that Florida wants to redistrict prior to the 2026 elections and prior to the 2030 census. We know it's unconstitutional under the Florida Fair District Amendments 5 and 6, and that it will not change our total of 28 representatives in the House of Representatives, and that a majority of the Floridians oppose this action, and that unfair maps undermine and weaken democracy. We'll be circulating information after today's call, which will include nopartisanmaps.org. That concludes our presentation. What questions can Heather and I answer for you? You will need to take yourself off mute to ask a question. First question is always the hardest. Rich or Sandy, do you have any commentary that you'd like to add?
I'm going to make two suggestions.
Great.
When you're lobbying this to any degree you want to, whether you're leaving a message at a legislator's office, calling them or seeing them directly about this in any way. I think there are two messages that are perfectly legitimate here, regardless of party. Because of the Florida Constitution, any action taken at this time to tamper with those maps will not accrue to the benefit or the reputation of the legislature as an institution. The public is going to understand that this is a manipulation that is not constitutional in Florida. Secondly, we know that the members of Congress themselves from both parties do not want this to happen. Some of them have even gone public. This is usually a matter that's discussed behind closed doors and in private conversations. But the members know that this is bad business for them, that their districts can be affected, and that people that are voting for them can change, and they do not like that. So this is another thing that you can remind our legislators about, that this is something that the congressional delegation, which would be tampered with by this step, is not something that our members of Congress want or need at this time. So those are two remarks that I would like to make.
Thank you, Rich. Sandy, I see you've taken yourself off mute. Thank you.
Well, whatever Rich said, he said it much more eloquently than I could have. I have a question, though, about the league's position going forward. If this comes to pass, and it certainly could, to what extent is the league working with other organizations in the state to try to contest the legality of these mid-decade changes?
So I don't have personal knowledge. I can refer all of us, though, to what happened when Florida passed and Governor DeSantis signed into law its version of the SAVE Act. The moment it was signed, the League Florida and other organizations filed its lawsuit. So, given what we know and given League Florida's position that has already been stated by President Jessica Lowe Minor several times, I think we can expect litigation. And I think we can expect the league to be joining in that.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you for your comment and questions, Sandy. Any other questions that we can answer today? So this evening, some of us know that there's another presentation. It is not the same. It is Understanding the Florida 2026 Legislative Session. And that's been publicized. And if you need information, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put the Speakers Bureau at lwvpbc.org. That's my email that you can reach out to me. Thank you, Heather, for co-presenting and co-hosting with me. If there
It
are
was a
no
pleasure.
other questions, we'll go ahead and say have a great Monday. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.